Yeah, please. You want over here?
All right. So, yeah, and I'll do it again. Unless, have you guys seen it?
Deb, I don't think. Where did Devin go? She didn't see it. Are you guys gonna?
I'm trying to figure this out. So go ahead.
Okay.
What table are we looking at in the?
So I'm looking on page 116 at table 11-9. And all of this stuff, the sheep brain is way more specific than the human brain. I think you won't have a problem with the human brain after we do the sheep brain. All right, so if we look at the top of the cerebrum, the sulci and the gyri, like I mentioned before, it's hills and valleys. That's all. So a gyri is where we see a hill, where it kind of sticks up. And then the sulcus is where it dips down. And again, that's just because this area of the brain grows so fast that the bone structure doesn't keep up with it. And so we get this kind of ridge-like pattern. The longitudinal fissure is this area here that separates the two cerebral hemispheres from each other. And then here's the cerebellum. So I had mentioned before, three main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and then the brainstem here. So I'm gonna flip him over. Now we're looking at the posterior surface of the brain, and we have the olfactory bulbs. So the olfactory bulbs are gonna be the part that sit right above the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and we're gonna see projections coming out of those through, remember all those holes in the cribriform plate? That makes the nasal epithelium. So those are going to be the smelling nerves that are coming through there. So these are the olfactory bulbs, and I think it's just a little bit easier to see in this guy. See how it's kind of, it's this tissue right here at the very front. So those are going to pick up sensory information from the nasal epithelium and relay that back to the brain through the olfactory tract. So the bundle that we called a nerve in the peripheral nervous system, we call it a tract when we're in the central nervous system. But same idea. It's going to be sort of what looks like a cut rubber band moving through the tissue. So that's the olfactory tract right there. Then the optic nerves. So the optic nerve that runs to the right eye is read by the left side or interpreted by the left side of the brain, and vice versa. So they have to cross. So these are the optic tracts because we're in the central nervous system. So this is one and this is the other, and they're moving, and this is where the eye would sit. So this one's going this way and this one's going this way, but it's been cut at what is called the chiasm, which is the intersection between the two. This is the optic chiasm in between, and then the two optic tracts on either side.
So which part is the actual optic nerve? I'm sorry.
So the optic nerve would be the part that comes outside of the cranial case, outside of the skull, because that's a nerve, which means we're in the peripheral nervous system.
Okay.
Optic chiasm, optic tract. The mammillary body. So the mammillary body is kind of right down here. It's sort of been pinned before, and so you can see a little bit of a hole, and that regulates our sucking reflex that we're born with, and so that's the mammillary body right under there. Let's see if I can see it. I can't really see it in this guy. This is the mammillary body. The pons. So the pons, in the brainstem, we have the midbrain, and I'll show you the back part of the midbrain here in a second. But remember the pons, I remembered it from, it's got that kind of the punch out area that you see of the P, that sort of balloonish area, and it kind of balloons up. Do you see it? Because it's subtle.
I see it.
But a little bit of a bulbular structure there. And if we look here in cross section, I think it's even easier with this mid-sagittal section that it's going to be this sort of smooth area here. And this lets us see sort of where it is with respect to the cerebellum too. It's going to be pretty close to right across, just anterior to the cerebellum. So that's the pons. And the pons, there's going to be a slight invagination here where we start the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata is going to have a little more width to it than the spinal cord. So becomes the spinal cord when it passes through the foramen magnum and exits the skull. So the cerebellum cerebellum I mentioned before when we were on the back. That is this structure down here, which is really important in coordinating our motor control. And now if we kind of open up the posterior part of the brain between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, we can see the back of the midbrain. The back of the midbrain has sort of 4 bumps to it called the corpora quadrumana. So I remember that. I would think of a corporation that has 4 buildings together, and that's the corpora quadrumana. In the human, these the superior parts of the corpora quadrumana are not so prominent. It really looks like 4 fairly even-sized balls on the back of the midbrain. And if you look right above that, you'll see the pineal gland, which is responsible for secreting melatonin, which helps you sleep at night. It tends to be secreted in darkness, and we think this is why we're diurnal, that is kind of the hormonal pattern that we follow. So, great. So there we go with column 1. So in the mid-sagittal section, the corpus callosum. So this is not a mid-sagittal section, but we can clearly see the corpus callosum if we open this up. That's going to be the commissure, or the track that connects the 2 sides of the brain that's most superior, right inside that longitudinal fissure. Okay. So if I do move to the sagittal section, this is not cut tissue, but this is cut down here. So here's our corpus callosum right here. And then just below that, remember, to the inside, if I were to stick my pin through here, I'd hit lateral ventricle, right, where we've got that cerebral spinal fluid, and this is the window over it. So this is the septum lucidum or septum pellucidum right here, and it's a really thin layer that's going to separate those 2 lateral ventricles. And then underneath that, we have another commissure, which means bridge between the 2 hemispheres, and that's the fornix. So this is the fornix underneath. And then if we continue to move down, we hit the thalamus. So the thalamus is sort of a circular mass here. And I lost my place. Oh, and the intermediate mass of the thalamus. So this is the thalamus. The intermediate mass, again, is the bridge that relays information between the 2 sides of the thalamus. And I don't see it really well here, but it will kind of be in the middle of the thalamus. It actually runs through the middle of the 3rd ventricle to relay that information in between. If we look, I'm going to switch over here to the coronal section or frontal view. Here we have the lateral ventricles. This one opens up for me better. So here we have the lateral ventricles. We have the corpus callosum up above. We have the fornix down below. We have the 3rd ventricle here, and the intermediate mass would be whatever bridge or connection we see between the 2 sides of the thalamus. So this is the thalamus, and this is the thalamus. And the area that's just underneath the thalamus is hypo to the thalamus, or the hypothalamus. So this is the hypothalamus down here. And then the cerebral aqueduct. So we have the thalamus here. We have the corpora quadrumana here. So now you're looking at it in a side view here. And we have the 4th ventricle down here. So the 4th ventricle doesn't look like much. It is just this little triangle between the back of the brainstem and the cerebellum. So do you see it? Do you see that there's this little bitty triangular space? The cerebral aqueduct is the canal that brings the cerebral spinal fluid to it. So it's just going to be between the cerebellum and the back of the brainstem here. So it is this canal right here leading to that 4th ventricle. And then that cerebral spinal fluid will come down here and it will go through the central canal of the spinal cord. We can also see in this view, you can see that arbor vitae, that tree-like structure in the cerebellum. And I think that's it. Great. And you did see the corpora quadrumana here, right?